Well, recently in the life of Aldersgate, we have been studying this book, Grounded, and last week we were going to have with us our wonderful author of the book, Grounded, but she has been so gracious to change her schedule and to be with us today so that we can still hear from her. I want to alert your attention really quick to the passage that was just read. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. In other translations, you might see it, your people will be my people, your God, my God. But in the Hebrew, this is actually much more powerful. There are no verbs at all in the Hebrew, just nouns. Your people, my people, your God, my God. This is powerful for us as we begin to think about what it looks like to encounter God in the world. What is the common good? These are the kind of questions that we have been wrestling with here at Aldersgate over the last few weeks. And I would like to invite forward Dr. Diana Butler Bass, the author of Grounded, to speak with us today, to kind of wrestle with us about these questions. Diana is actually an author, but not just an author, a blogger, a columnist. She travels the world speaking all over the place to people. I will say that my seminary friends, if they find out that I am with her today, will geek out. I might take a selfie later. I totally might. But they'll geek out. They'll be so jealous of me. It's a big deal. It's a big deal that she's here today. You have written how many books?
9.
9 books.
Yeah.
Wow.
Am I on? There we go. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Now
She's written 9 books, and I will say that some of her books have been really instrumental in the way I view the church and the way we've kind of created the vision of Kingstown as well.
That's great.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
I could actually hear that in your comments.
Oh, really? Okay, good.
Yeah, I would dream up an ashes to go with a cup of joe.
Yeah,
that would be a thing I would like to do.
Yeah. Well, we've been. That's what we're trying to do at Kingstown is think about what it means. So our tagline at Kingstown is welcome to the table. And what does it mean to say that some of the most profound conversations about life and faith just happen sitting around our dining room tables?
Wow.
So, but it also has this other meaning of, and we will talk about this, of welcome to the table that Christ lays for us in His blood and in His and in His flesh, that we may partake in the body of Christ and be a part of that. So, I in thinking about your book and working through this, I know that you have. I mean, you actually had this experience of working to the point of this grounded, aha moment. So can you give us a little bit of the background of that? How did you work to that moment?
Yeah, it's funny being an author because I don't have like this gigantic publishing plan laid out in my mind about all the books I want to write before I die. Mm-hmm. Instead, what happens to me is that books sneak up on me and they come from unexpected places. So Grounded came from a place that was really, truly unexpected. It came from my backyard. And that was in 2012. I had just written my last book. And I came home in June from the tour, and I was exhausted. When you do a book tour, if you're home 3 nights in a row, that's like an incredible grace. And it gets so tiring. So I was out all during the spring of 2012, and I came home. We literally live within a stone's throw of here. Oh, yeah. It's about 8-10.
Sometimes
I can walk. I do walk here
right.
on some of my morning walks.
And for those of you who don't know already, Diana's husband is Richard, our communications director here, and I know that Richard sometimes walks here.
Yeah, it's great to just be part of the neighborhood. So I came home, and I went to my backyard, and it was a beautiful June day. And Richard was back in the backyard, and he was playing with our dog, Rowan, and Emma was hanging around the backyard, and the garden was beginning to come up, the sun was shining, and I was so happy to be home. But I realized that I had been sort of dislocated over the last couple months, and that I had forgotten what it was like to be part of a neighborhood, and even to feel my feet on the ground. Because I've been in so many airplanes. So I literally sat down the step in my backyard and I just said, I wish somebody would ground me.
Right.
And Richard just looks at me, and he said, he's been a book author, or book publisher for years, and he says, grounded. That would be a good book title. And
It's that simple.
I know. And I said, yeah, it kind of would be. And then he sort of pressed me a little further in the way that editors do, and he said, what is it that grounds you anyway? And that's a really, really great question. What is it that grounds you? And I had just passed my 50th birthday, and I realized that I think, at least for me in the second half of life piece, that's an important question, is to figure out what is it that I love about being here on the earth, and to really enjoy and dig my feet into the beautiful ground beneath my feet, and not forget it. You know, being alive is an amazing thing.
Right.
So.
Right. And so on your book, the tagline is a spiritual revolution.
Yeah.
And so like connecting the word grounded with spiritual revolution is really interesting, and it reminded me and the clergy here at Aldersgate of our tagline for Aldersgate, welcome to a revolution. And so when we saw that tagline on your book, we immediately went out, we have to get a copy of this book. We have to know, because not very many people use this word.
Right. Revolution is, I said earlier today too, revolution is kind of a weird word for a church to use, because revolution implies an upending, overturning something. And I think oftentimes when we think about church, we think of a place of comfort, or a place where we sort of confirm one another in our beliefs. We don't think about that kind of radical transformation that breaks in to our lives and disrupts us. But I have long considered the gospel itself as the Jesus revolution. Is that when Jesus came into the world, it was a disruption of the way that things were, of the empire, a disruption of certain kinds of expectations of what religion meant. And so the Jesus revolution should naturally transform itself into sort of a revolutionary community of faith. But part of my sort of thinking about you guys using the word revolution in your tagline is, I grew up a United Methodist. I go to an Episcopal church now. It's nothing you did, believe me. I appreciate my Methodist heritage incredibly deeply. But I grew up in the Methodist church in the 1960s. And the last thing that anybody would have been talking about in church was the revolution. The revolution, what was happening in the streets in the 1960s when I was a little girl, and my parents and my grandparents were terrified of revolution. And so they taught me that the church was the place to be safe, away from that stuff. Right. And so, we've had a sort of idea, I think, for a couple generations that the church is not a revolutionary community, but it's a community of comfort. And we can't afford that.
We can't
anymore.
Yeah, but there's still this question. This question remains of, how is this a revolution, really? How is this a new way of thinking? Yeah. Haven't people been seeking after God for forever?
Yeah. Well, that's what I try to explain in the book, how this is a revolution. And part of the argument I make is that yes, people have always been interested in God. But our ancestors, including my ancestors who founded the Methodist Church in my neighborhood in Baltimore when I was growing up, and my parents, my grandparents, and my ancestors further back, when they did not ask the question, where is God? They assumed they knew where God was. God was in heaven. God had an address. And the primary problem of people who have gone before us in history is, if God is in heaven and we're here on earth, well, how do these two things connect? And so we developed theologies and sacramental ideas and ritual that connected the two. And so our ancestors, their primary issue was, how do you find a path to a God who is in this far-off place? And which of those available paths seem to have the most meaning in my life? And which one will give me purpose? So our ancestors were not asking the question, where is God? They were simply asking the question, how do you get to a God who is already in heaven? And so when you listen carefully today, I hear this question all the time when I'm just doing my regular life, standing in line at Starbucks, talking to my friends.
Where is God?
Yeah, I actually have people ask me the question, where is God, if I'm paying attention, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 times a day. And I have never had anybody ask me a question like, how must I be saved? You know, the great question of John chapter 3, you know, what do I do to be saved? Nobody's ever asked me that question. But people always are asking me the question, my best friend has cancer, and I just don't know where God is.
Right.
You know, how could it be that she could be so sick? Or, how could it be that a good and gracious God allows people to use God's name to chop off the heads of people in the Middle East? Where is God?
Right.
And so if you think about the questions of our age, they're not really questions about how do I get saved as an individual person, but they're really questions about, if there is a God, what is that? Is that God asleep?
Right.
Where's that God hanging out? Because that God does not seem to be showing up. And so part of what I try to argue in the book is that we've been talking about God in the wrong ways and looking in the wrong places. And that to answer the question, where is God, it involves us to walk into the space of our lives, into our world, and really see what is beautiful and sacred and just and joyful that is all around us.
Right.
And so the place that I come to, literally by walking the streets of this neighborhood and paying attention to life here, is that God is in nature and God is in my neighborhood. And I'm so pleased that I could be here talking about this, because my spiritual life changed by walking along the Potomac River, which I do 2 to 3 miles every day when I can be there. It's very icy right now. I don't suggest it at the moment. And also walking around my neighborhood and paying attention and relinking my life to the lives of people who live on the streets right around me. And doing these 2 things, being in nature and being in the neighborhood, made the Bible sort of come alive to me in ways that it had never done before. And and in that process, God was relocated for me in a very intimate way. And that's what Grounded is about.
Yeah. And it's funny that in neighbor and in nature, and these things are right in the vicinity of your home, but and yet you can find nature and neighbor anywhere. And so, it reminded me of this quote from actually the home chapter of your book. So I'm going to read it and then ask a few questions about it. So here's the quote: "Questions about home are almost inevitably where questions. Where are you from? Where is your home? Where do you live? The query anticipates something far more than an address. Home is more than a house. It's a sacred location, a place of aspiration and dreams, of learning and habit, of relationships and heart. Home is the geography of our souls, where, and the where questions of home naturally open to the spiritual question of where is God." And when I was thinking of the word home, I kept actually thinking I could replace that word with table, and it would make complete sense for Kingstown. Like, the word table is this geography of our souls. And so
I talk about tables quite a bit in that chapter.
You do? Okay.
I do.
So,
I talk about doorways and tables in that chapter.
And doorways and tables are what we see time and time again where God shows up in Scripture, too.
Yeah,
doorways and
right.
tables. So my question is, there are so many people who believe that they can experience nature and neighbor without being grounded in a community of faith like this. And so I know that as a pastor, I mean, you all are pretty convinced that I believe in this, or I probably wouldn't be here on Sunday morning. I believe in the corporate body of the saints gathering together. But there are so many people who would hear what you just said about how you find God. Where is God? I find God in neighbor and in nature. Well, then why do we need this then?
When I was on the book tour for this book, which was last fall, which has been a lot of fun, the Pew Forum let out its most recent survey about religion in America. And in the back part of the survey, which nobody ever comments on in the front headlines of the news, there is actually the most interesting part of the survey. The big headline on the front of the survey was the more people are leaving religion than ever. And right now in the United States, 1 out of every 4 Americans is religiously unaffiliated. I mean, that is the highest number it's ever been. It's 23% of the population, and it's going up rapidly. So that was the headline. But in the back part of the survey, there was this other piece, and that was, despite what was in the headline, 65% of Americans experienced a sense of God's presence in their relationships, their families, their neighbors in the previous week. And half of all Americans experienced a sense of God. I think they used awe and wonder as the God word. Experienced a sense of awe and wonder in nature. So what we have is the circumstance that you just described, is a lot of people are bypassing religious labels, religious institutions, congregational life, and are connecting directly to God through their relationships and through the natural world. Now, that is great. I think that what we have to do as church people is recognize that the experiences that people are having outside church are incredibly legitimate experiences of God. And right now, a lot of us who are in church think that those are less than experiences, and we can't do that. Because that's really diminishing or demeaning our neighbors' experiences of God. Instead, I think it behooves us to actually move into those same experiences and say, hey, gosh, I had this extraordinary experience of God when I was at the beach last summer in North Carolina, and there was the sunset, and it was profound and moving. And the question then becomes to your neighbor who might be saying something like this to you, or your kid, because this is our children and our grandchildren are saying things like this. When you have an experience like that, what do you do with it? Does it cause you to act more justly? Does your soul fill with love? Do you connect more deeply to the poor and the oppressed? What do you do with that experience? And then you can kind of get into a different sort of conversation. So I really am worried about when church diminishes those experiences and says that they're not important. They are very important, and they are where a lot of the action is happening about people's life with God. Instead of poo-pooing them, we need to really be able to talk about those kinds of experiences, and we need to be able to link them into the faith experience that we have in terms of the Jesus story, in terms of life around a table, in terms of doing justice in the world. And I mentioned to you earlier that over the last couple of weeks, I was with 2 different friends, one who was Jewish, one who was an atheist, and both of them said the same thing to me, which was fascinating. They said that they thought I was right, that spirituality is just an enormously powerful thing, that the presence, that people are really still interested in God. My atheist friend was giving me this point. And then they both, each said in a different way, but the problem is that contemporary people lack a language and a place to talk about those experiences and to help them make sense. And that's what I think the church is about in the 21st century. A language of spiritual experience and a place where we can actually talk about where we find God and how that changes us. And we don't often give each other permission to do that, even in the church. We're kind of afraid of those experiences. So I would love to see us be able to do that better.
I was meeting with a friend this past week who recently lost his father, and each person in his family, they're all trying to figure out their own way of dealing with grief, and he has been extraordinary at dealing with his grief, and he's taken to meditation. But as we were having this conversation over and over again, he kept saying, and in that I sense this kind of universe divine, or I sense this force, or and he could not figure out, he could not put the word God on it. Like it didn't feel comfortable. Didn't feel comfortable. He's still at that state, and he also admitted that it's church hasn't been for him. Church hasn't been for him, but that meditation has been this form of getting outdoors, has been this form of coping with grief. And after hearing what you say, I'm like, well, what a wonderful step towards step to be able to offer the church as a means to put language to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That the church, and to be able to hear someone's story and find a story in Scripture with Jesus that resonates in this profound way. Yeah.
And if we think about the Gospels, so they are really a collection of Jesus stories.
That's exactly right.
About his spiritual experience and how the way he connected with God, walking around the world, just was absolutely compelling to his neighbors.
Yeah.
So that they followed him. They weren't following him because he held out a doctrinal statement and said, here, sign this, and if you sign this, I'm going to let you into heaven when you die.
Right.
That was not the point. The point was there was this person who seemed to have this deep sense of seeing and experiencing God in the world, and that was what his neighbors were so enthralled by. And so that's, those are just things we have to really get ourselves focused on what's important.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, as we, as a church, are trying to wrestle with this of how do we give value to that kind of experience of faith while not forsaking what we know here. And so, in your book, here's another quote from your book. The good news is that God is closer than ever before. And many people are making new connections with the spirit of love and life to heal the broken places of the world. The spiritual revolution does not destroy the church, unless, of course, the church ignores it, or denies it, or dismisses it, or pushes it away.
Which is happening in some places,
happening.
And it's really sad.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder what advice you would have for us. What ways could you... What ways could you give us? I don't know, to be thinking about how this idea of nature and neighbor connects with what we know here.
Yeah, well, I love what you started with. When I'd been talking to Hetty, she started with the idea of revolution. You started with the idea of table. And earlier this year, this one woman from Sojourners Magazine was talking to me. She interviewed me. And she asked me what I thought were the most important visions or sort of metaphors for church in the 21st century. And I immediately said two things. I said table and garden. And you've hit the table one really strong. And that whole idea of the table as the sort of the heart of the home and God dwelling with us. And I mean, it's so rich. But the other one is really profound. Think about, and I have spent an awful lot of time in the last 3 years just studying the first 3 chapters of Genesis. I think that if you understand the first 3 chapters of Genesis, you can read the entire Bible with new eyes. It's just such an amazing thing. And so Grounded talks a lot about gardens, because of course that's where we encounter the dirt.
Right.
And over the work that I've been doing in recent years, I kept running into churches that had gardens. And at first I thought it was really kooky. Why in the world are these churches planting gardens? And then I began to realize there was real theological and justice meaning to what they were doing. Just a couple weeks ago, I was at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta. And they have planted this huge garden. And it's in the garden, when the days are nice and the garden is growing, that the theological students go out in the garden. They study the Bible in the garden.
Yeah.
So can you imagine doing the first 3 chapters of Genesis with Walter Brueggemann in a garden? Oh my gosh, it blows my mind how amazing that must be. So they're there with their Old Testament professor talking about Genesis, digging carrots up.
Yeah.
And then they go out there and they can do their ethics class there, and they talk about soil farming, and they talk about climate change, and they talk about economic inequality and the call of justice on the church. And then they also have chapel in the garden. And the students at the seminary were telling me that the most formative experience that they have had in their 3 or 4 years there has been that connection of living out the stories in the actual space of the garden. And so I love that, and that leads me to my final thought for Aldersgate. As your neighbor, I drive past here all the time. And every time I see that piece of ground right there, I see a farm. I see Aldersgate growing vegetables in a community garden that would feed the hungry on Route 1. Because right now, the poor people on Route 1, who you do so much for, those food pantries are full of food that most people in this church wouldn't eat. Full of cans of squishy peas that have BPA in the lining of the tin, or pickled beets. And come on, people, really. Pickled beets and squished peas. It's good food if you have no food, but it's not good food. And yet the folks on Route 1 who need good food can't afford Balducci's, they can't afford Whole Foods, they can't even afford our beautiful farmers market. What if we in our neighborhood grew food for them? And also invited people to come and farm with us? The idea of farming that land and creating a garden of justice for our neighborhood would be extraordinary. Those of us who are just sort of backyard gardeners could learn a lot from one another. People in the congregation who are elderly, who used to love to garden, who can't garden anymore because they either live at Paul Spring or because they're just, gardening's hard work. You can't do it alone when you get older. They could do a garden like that. The little kids in the Sunday school could grow vegetables and learn Bible stories in a garden. I just think that if we could move some of the stories of Jesus outside, and you're the only church in town, well, the St. Aidan's has enough space. They do a garden behind the church. I can't figure out why they don't do it in the front yard. If you're one of the few places that's big enough to actually do this. And you would also have people like me who would come along and just be part of the garden community.
Automatic partners.
You would have automatic partners. And so anyway, things like that would be so simple and so beautiful, and you would learn the Bible afresh, and people would be fed.
Wow. Well, as God's given you that kind of vision every time you drive by, perhaps God is also connecting people with that vision as well right now, who knows. And I thank you so much for allowing us to engage with your book with you. This has been really special for us. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you. I love talking about it.
Thank you. I offer this to you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Would you pray with me?